So, Miss Angela, welcome to the People for Liberty podcast. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from?
Sure. I am currently a sex educator, passionate about teaching students the idea of sex for recreation or sex for other than reproduction, and how the digital age has changed the landscape. There are a whole lot of variances, nuances with the digital world that didn't exist 10 years ago and aren't being taught. Also, I am one of the founding members of Reproductive Liberty Coalition.
Yeah, I'm listening. Reproductive Liberty Coalition. Sorry, this is a fascinating subject because I've been talking about this quite a bit. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Because I was taught in South Carolina where if you had questions about these things, they're like, what about sex? They're like, don't have it. Don't think about it. It's not worth it.
So I was born in Indiana and I'm in my 40s. The idea of what a woman did for sex in those days was much different than what it is now. I'm currently the mother of 3 fantastic humans, 2 of which are adults that now have their own families. Also the wife of a man that I would be honored to have my daughter marry, the kind of man. He's that kind of man.
Okay.
And he was also born in Indiana, which I'm not sure is relevant, but he was. I've lived in California, Chicago, Florida, Colorado, Virginia, and a couple of places more than once. So I've had the opportunity to talk to a plethora of different kinds of people from many, many, many different walks of life, many different backgrounds, and grown to understand and respect the idea that, well, also I'm really upset about what it is that you get for sex education as, I think middle school is where we pretty much start teaching it.
Yeah, 6th or 7th grade, I think.
Right, and it doesn't involve the majority of things that youngsters need to know about sex. It talks about, in the anatomy books, we have page after page after page about penis and testicles, and a couple of pages about the uterus, maybe a single page about the external vulva. Never ever does it mention the only single organ that either a male or a female, biological male or female, has with the sole purpose of pleasure. It never ever teaches either, and this is only in this country, by the way, it doesn't teach young men or young women anything about the pleasure organ of a woman. In fact, there is nothing in any of the education that teaches that a woman deserves to be pleasured or should be or even can be. And that's part of where my passion stemmed from in education, and the idea that it's time, it's long past time, that women should be taught. We're allowed to enjoy it, that we are supposed to enjoy it. In fact, we shouldn't be having it if we're not enjoying it.
Well, that's the key part. You're just here to spread more joy in the world through education.
That is. It definitely is.
So what attracted you to the libertarian side when talking about sex education specifically?
I've been a nonconformist my whole life. I was born to a biological mother who was an addict and didn't know who my father was. So she raised me in her own relative manner. When I was 5, she gave birth to another daughter, so it would have been my half-sister, or it was my half-sister, who had a significant amount of brain damage from seizures in utero and upon delivery. So she had the use of like a really insignificant amount of her brain, and that she was significantly disabled for her all of 10 years. And I remember as a young child growing up with a really sexualized environment, mostly because of the circumstances of, being surrounded by drugs and people who are more concerned with consuming them than they are with being role models. When I was 5, I have this distinct memory of having chairs lined up outside, and they had the little girls dancing with boas for the neighborhood. You know what a boa is? Feathered thing.
Okay, yeah.
Your neck. And I just can't even fathom that as an adult now. At 7, I remember falling in love with one of my mom's boyfriends, and that ended in consummation. And at the time, I felt like I had given consent. And when I work now within the idea of education, and I work with trauma victims, I see a whole lot of children who were abused who come to me and tell me that they don't feel like they were abused. They think they gave consent. And I'm talking about people as young as I was at 7, or as young as, some people are even younger than 7. But even through teen years, I hear people tell me that they felt like they gave consent. And you and I both know as adults, that's not a physical possibility. But there's no education out there. There's nothing for people to fall back on unless somebody recognizes that you've been a victim. So there's no education in the beginning that says, hey, this is grooming behavior and this isn't okay. And just because an adult tells you something that encourages your emotion doesn't make it consent. And so then I became compassionate. I became passionate about consent as well. The idea that a 15-year-old who was groomed by her uncle to wear high heels on his chest for his own fetish pleasure, and she consented to it, even at the age of 15, when you might know better, or you might be expected to know better, blows my mind, and the kind of guilt that women are carrying around with them without having any recourse from the beginning. Does that make sense?
Sure. What I'm really interested in is how does sex education relate into women's equality more than anything else?
Well, you can imagine how empowering it is to recognize that sex is fun.
Yeah,
we have a very sexualized environment for men, and it is, everything is man related. It's, when we look at the actual statistics, gay men orgasm 90% of the time, straight men 80% of the time, lesbian women about 70% of the time, and straight women are in the 40s to 50s. So we're looking at the lowest number of women who are having sex with men, not enjoying it, not being able to climax. Understanding, one, the empowerment of the idea that sex for recreation is okay for women. It's not, we're not calling you names. It's, the age-old idea that men are allowed to have sex with multiple partners, and enjoy sex, by the way, but women aren't. We are supposed to be submissive. We are supposed to be providers of sex. We are supposed to be objects of sex. We're not supposed to like it. So just that alone pushes the envelope to equality. In fact, one of the reasons I became a therapist in the first place is because I recognize that men, as they age, continue to identify with their masculinity as their penis and their genitalia in total. And if anything goes wrong with their ability to continue to use that, it affects more of their emotion, more of their outward decision-making processes than pretty much any other thing, any other ailment or depression, anxiety that exists out there. So the idea that, one, women can become empowered to actually enjoy sex and have it when they want it as opposed to when it's expected. And two, for men to be able to grow older and still be able to utilize sex again for recreation so that they can not lose that connection, that attachment to their inner soul.
Yeah, and consent's interesting with that, especially with women's equality, like understanding consent. Can you tell me just a little bit more of your thoughts on just between adults and how that empowers women is understanding consent and having that?
Can you ask the beginning part of that question again?
Yeah, just generally consent involved and how it relates to women's equality, because obviously it's a hugely important part, and sometimes it seems like we're having trouble defining that as a society about what is consent. It shouldn't be that hard. Most libertarians, it seems pretty straightforward.
That's one of the reasons I love the liberty movement, because it is intended to recognize the idea of consent, do no harm to others, right? The rest of the world, not so much. And the idea, even when I watch educators try to define consent, I see them applying it in a black and white situation, even if it's gray, like somebody who has been drinking. But what I don't see them do is apply it to life situations. Consent doesn't exist if you've asked 3 times for sex and somebody is manipulated or guilted into or pressured into sexual experiences. That's not consent. Consent is not bringing up a conversation and continuing to force it, regardless of its nature, regardless of the context. So, for instance, if we were talking about something traumatic that happened in your life and you felt uncomfortable, I immediately no longer have consent, right, to continue this conversation. If we are out to eat and you decided you wanted a salad and I'm like, hey, I think you should really try this steak, and you say, no, I don't want the steak, right. I have to recognize that falls into the idea of consent and to respect your decision to not have the steak that I want to push at you. And that's probably where I think people fail overall. And then again, as I said earlier, it's proactive. It's teaching young men, young women, young non-binary humans how to approach the situation when you are placed in something that makes you uncomfortable, how to have a safety plan, and how to not be that person who pushes beyond consent.
Interesting. One of the bigger the draws of the Libertarian Party is we're one of the few talking about the rights of sex workers in America today, and how a victimless crimes bill also includes that. For me, it's more about, like, if we really want to focus on human trafficking, let's focus on that and stop wasting police time with, consenting adults and how this works. But maybe that would tease up. Do you know much about the sex rights workers movement in America, with the Liberty movement?
Absolutely. I started being interested in sex workers at a very young age, for obvious reasons, I suppose. And I've since become a significant member of an activist community in Indianapolis where support of sex workers is not the same as, say, it is in Florida. You probably experienced something similar in South Carolina. Conservative places tend to have more trafficking and less opportunity for people. In fact, one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do when they took the Backpage, when they shut down Backpage, they took away sex workers' ability to pre-screen and to collect payment securely and confidentially, right? So now there's a complete loss of safety net, and police are focusing on streetwalkers who are, there's a large percentage of streetwalkers that are trafficked, and it doesn't necessarily fall into the women in semis or young children in semis being shipped around and introduced to drugs. Sometimes it's women who are already introduced to drugs and somebody is utilizing that situation to traffic them. But it definitely happens on a large scale. one of my dear friends who continues the fight in Indianapolis has a safe house where he provides resources for women who are on the street, feminine supplies, feminine napkins, cleansing supplies, and he offers them safety by virtue of allowing them into his home if they ever decide that they're ready to move into a different direction, and he offers that safety and defends it, obviously, with his Second Amendment. So he's been in some pretty precarious situations, and the people who are trafficking these sex walkers are not interested in losing their return on their investment, so they respond violently sometimes. So it's not necessarily easy, and in addition to having to fight with or worry about police and arrests, you're also dealing with the people who intend to harm you. And then an additional issue is not being able to properly prepare. So one of the initiatives that we started there, because it's obviously different than Florida,
Sure.
Is having a volunteer network of people willing to accompany an escort, for instance, to a client meeting and remain within a safety plan and some relative close, not too far distance from the actual client meeting, so that they have someone paying attention, someone actively involved, and also to serve as a deterrent. So I talked a little bit more about the community aspect than I did the police aspect. I feel like because the police aspect is probably something that we all pretty much hone in on. Nobody wants victims. Nobody wants consenting adults to ever have to go to jail for consenting to sex. That's the most ridiculous, other than the plant, having a flower that sends you to jail. It's the most ridiculous law in the books. 100% against it, 100% in support of consent. And when you have two or more consenting adults of sound mind who are interested in any exchange of their free will, they should be allowed to do it.
It seems like it would clean up a lot of the things that provide dangerous elements too within there. Like, it wouldn't be that hard to have somebody watching a buzz door that you could prepare for, those kind of things, if it wasn't illegal in the first place. So maybe that's just one of the bigger stats of a victimless crimes bill in general, how it would affect women, I think, more than anybody else, is ending these kind of drug wars, but also letting people be truly pro-choice as long as you're not hurting anybody else through force or fraud. Did you come from any other parties, or did you come straight into the kind of the Libertarian Party?
Oh, no. I'm a bleeding heart, and I during my first bout in college for my first undergrad degree, I was introduced to the idea of libertarians as Republicans who like to smoke pot. Mm-hmm. And my brief experience with libertarians in those days was pretty negative. And so I never really jumped ship into the liberty movement. And at that point, I was working on a woman's campaign. Her name is Jill Long. She was a congresswoman. She was my first campaign. So she's a Democrat. And I did 2 cycles with her. And then I did another Democrat who ran for mayor for 2 cycles. And then I worked for Obama in his first run. And then after that, I realized that I just can't stomach it. I literally can't move forward. And I think there's a point where you come to terms as a human, like, I cannot deal with this regulation and watch it harm people. In fact, there was a significant movement at the time from an association called the American Family Association, mm-hmm. and they were working really hard with the intent of shutting down gentlemen's clubs. And in real life, without gentlemen's clubs, there would be a lot more abusive sexual interactions on a large scale, whether it's people who are predators of children or people who are abusers of women who are adults, there would be a lot more sex crime, a lot more victim crime if these establishments didn't exist. And that's one side of it. The other side of it is that it's obviously 100% consensual. And then the other side of it is that there are people within the economy and their local economies that depend on that turnaround of revenue, and it's really good for the economy in a multitude of different ways. So working against, I should say, the American Family Association is one of the things that brought me out of the Democratic Party and into the liberty movement, because I watched them do nothing. They didn't do anything. They whined about it. They cried about it. They said, hey, this probably isn't okay. But they didn't do anything. And we needed an active movement to stop this, because they were going to shut down. And they were trying to do things like use zoning as their bully to shut down clubs. They were trying to pass laws that offered or created and mandated a 10-foot rule between customer and entertainer. And it was just, small processes to be able to get to shut down. And so that was the point where I was like, okay, I kind of have to come to terms with this. I do not belong here anymore. I can't stomach it. And I'm out.
Well, it's always interesting to see, how different people come to be libertarians, because they're a very diverse group of people. United by saying, I don't want to run your life and you don't want to run mine. I think that works out. But it's always interesting to see from the left side as well, because we always get talked about as the Republicans who smoke pot, which it's true, though. The libertarians talk very differently than Republicans do.
They definitely do. And I was really pleased to see that, because I get my life as a Democrat, I got to see Republicans in a different light maybe than libertarians even do, because they hated me. They absolutely hated every part of me because I was not on their team. Now I can say exactly what I want, exactly what I mean, and exactly what I feel. And now I get, I don't understand you. What are you saying? Okay, maybe that makes sense. And maybe you're not wholly wrong. And there's still a significant number of people who are tied to presidential campaigns, but not necessarily to local campaigns or statewide campaigns or state level campaigns, who are willing to put their vote for somebody that they actually deem worthy of the position.
Yeah. And it's weird, too, that coming from just the side of sex education is your push for what do you think would have a maximum impact for gender equality? Needs to just letting people know more about their bodies and who they are, and talking. Why do you think there's such a taboo about that in America today?
I think it was created. It's programmed. It is part of the colonization of America. It came here with the people who intended to colonize this country, and it has little by little by little by little been pushed. But somebody always has to be lesser status for anybody to be elevated status, and there was just too long that women allowed it to be them. And in the same vein, it's been too long that minorities allowed it to be them, or still allow it to be them, and sometimes it's women who allow it to be them. But ultimately, being empowered, and so the idea of consent goes to a further corner in that if you are having sex for recreation, if you intend as a biological male to ejaculate into a biological female, you need to have consent. Without consent, here, right there, is the difference between pro-life and pro-choice. If you don't want to have an abortion, you need to get consent for ejaculation. Women need to understand that it's their choice. It is completely up to them to say, that's not okay, don't do that, and to ensure that that's not a thing. And I think once women are empowered to fully understand the idea of sex for recreation and that their pleasure is equally important as their partner's pleasure, then they'll care more about the idea of the recreational aspect of sex and take more precautions in preventing things like how many women are pregnant with unwanted pregnancies and didn't even enjoy the adventure to get there, right? So changing that whole worldly aspect in this country is why it matters and how it empowers women.
Cool. Who would you say are some of the more influential women within the liberty movement that you look up to or get excited about talking about?
My favorite is Jess Mears. Jess is the most organized, the most, she's a powerhouse. It's hard to really compare her to many other people. She's a force. She's probably the most pure, well-spoken, radical and pragmatic libertarian as a woman that we have.
Interesting. Well, cool beans. Do you have anything you'd like to say to everybody listening?
Happy Women's Equality Day. Please celebrate. If you have any questions about education or you're interested in sex for recreation or reproductive liberty rights, please visit us. The website for education is restorevirility.com, and Reproductive Liberty Coalition exists on Facebook. There is a website, but I don't think it's ready yet, so I'm not going to share that just yet. We've just recently become organized.
Yeah, Lauren's been a big pusher of the Reproductive Liberty Coalition as well.
Thank you, Lauren.
It's going to be a big, important battle, I feel like, because that's where the social conservatives are kind of coalescing around. Like, they've lost almost every battle they've engaged in on the social side, right? From rock and roll, interracial marriage, what bathroom you can use. And so one of the points where they do have some valid options, I think, is talking about pro-life and pro-choice, because you're talking about personhood and when somebody comes around. But if they're coming in from one angle, I think they're going to lose a lot of different people, and this needs to be a discussion that
right, and seriously. I think the idea that we were founded to bridge the gap to say, hey, nobody wants to have an abortion. Nobody wakes up today and says, hey, I'm going to go have an unwanted, or I'm going to go create an unwanted pregnancy so that I can go abort it. That's not a thing.
So not what the kids are up to these days?
I'm sorry?
That's not what the kids are up to these days?
Not at least by and far. So the vast majority of people are not happy to find out that they are carrying an unwanted pregnancy. So we have to say, okay, there are other solutions. There are free market solutions, one of which is education. And we need to just eliminate government from the personal choice of a woman and educate both men, women, and all of our entire society, all humans, to understand what it is. Fun fact, the evolution of the female genitalia has changed over the years. For instance, in order for a cat to release an egg to become pregnant, the cat must have an orgasm, female cat. That's not the case for women anymore, and it once was a very, 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 very long time ago. There
women
used
for
to be
hundreds of thousands of years have just given up.
Yes, and because
yeah.
because we allowed failure. If it hadn't happened, we wouldn't have been able to reproduce and maintain, a society of humans. So Darwin came in and said, "Okay, you're not getting the job done. We're going to do this to make sure that it's you're still able to reproduce and have additional people on the planet."
So tell me just a little bit more about the Republican Liberty Coalition, or not the reproductive, not Republican.
So the idea of this coalition is to bridge the gap between people who are pro-life and people who are pro-choice and recognize that the one thing that we agree on is that nobody wants to have an abortion and that we want to support keeping government out of the equation. We want to support people who need to have education or counseling or even further than just the idea of abortion. If you want to have your child born at home, if you want to have a midwife as your birthing partner, or if you want to have a water birth, all of these things where government keeps trying to push its infringement on and create regulations for and different mandates, and state to state it's always different, but it's not their job, it's not the government's job. And so it's our intention to be able to lobby that narrative that we need to keep government out of it so that we can keep it. For instance, if women want birth control over the counter, should they be able to get it? And we say yes, they should be able to get it.
Yeah.
That's a pretty easy task, right? You can get plan B, but you can't get plan A. That doesn't even make sense.
Well, for me, it's always been a weirder thing with abortion that if you took how the law would actually have to work is that you have to register every single pregnancy, probably every menstrual cycle with the government, because you have to investigate every single miscarriage as a potential murder trial. There's a huge security apparatus that goes into that. If you're saying that every human being is a full, protected human life, liberty, and property from day one, there's a lot of stuff that goes into actually making that law work. Can you talk a little bit about Planned Parenthood? Do you think funding it is a good idea at the federal level or not?
So this is a really, really difficult topic for me personally, because in the 90s, Planned Parenthood was the only place a woman could go to get any services. And without them, there would have been so many more women staying quiet about domestic abuse and about rape and there was no such thing as date rape before Planned Parenthood. Obviously it happened, but Planned Parenthood is literally the organization that brought about the awareness of date rape so that women could recognize that you don't have to have sex with somebody just because they bought you dinner, because that used to be a thing. The evolution of Planned Parenthood breaks my soul, because they used to have very, very definitive lines. We are here for recreational, we're here for STIs, we're here for education, we're here for counseling, we're here to make sure that every woman has access to birth control, every woman has access to healthy cervix services. And then they moved into a realm of the world that I just don't think was appropriate for them, especially receiving federal funding. I am extremely unapologetically pro-choice personally, but I'm not still okay with my tax money going toward somebody's abortion. I would like to have consent. You know what I mean? Like, if I want to participate in somebody's abortion, maybe I want to give them education, maybe I want to counsel them, maybe I don't want to put money on the table for it. So in that aspect, I can't support them. The direction that they went was their demise ultimately, and we need some other organization or for them to back down from where they've come.
Well, it's been weird because the Republicans are the same tactics the Democrats have used on gun control for a long time when it comes to abortion, and making it much harder to access. So your hospital has to have 16-foot hallways, and it's limited the amount of choices for how many abortion clinics are available. And some might say that Planned Parenthood had to fight just by stepping into that game. You had to be a big enough player to continue to fight the increased regulation that the government was throwing on. I'm not, just throwing out the devil's advocate here side for what Planned Parenthood had to step in and try and do it. I understand not having the federal government pay for other people's stuff. It's a complicated question, isn't it?
It really is, and that's why it's a difficult one for me in particular, especially knowing that without them, in the 90s through the early 2000s, women would not have had access to affordable birth control pills or even other options, because there are many times where the hormones in birth control pills don't mesh well with a woman's body, and it hurts. It causes more harm to take the pills. So the idea that you can get an IUD or you could have a Depo-Provera shot or the multitude of different options that exist and moved were created from the 90s and throughout the 2000s, they were the forefront. They were the place that women could go to get help, to get health services when you didn't have insurance, or you couldn't tell your parents or your partner that you were raped. That was the place that you could go that was safe. And I can't not support it because of its history and how much it really, it moved the idea of women. I mean, it empowered women for sure, but it definitely pushed the narrative that women have to and deserve to have a safe place. And then I just think their direction went, you know, in the wrong, they definitely took the wrong direction.
Well, it seems like there's definitely need for more private charities within that region to step up and talk about not just options about abortion, just about anything. And, you know, maybe sex education is one of the most important things, because that's how a lot of people do seem to get hurt and deeply psychologically scarred. What do you think about Joe Biden and Donald Trump when it comes to sexual harassment?
I think they're both dictionary definitions of male predators. I'm not even sure that there's a better picture perfect example of entitled white men who feel like they are, I mean, not Donald Trump, but Joe Biden doesn't use the phrase pussy grab, but come on, this is exactly what they were put in here, and they're the people who make women feel like we're not supposed to enjoy it. Yeah. I don't like either of them, obviously.
I think there's a lot of people in America that don't, and that's why Jo Jorgensen might be one of the more interesting candidates that's out there right now. How do you feel about her and her run for office right now?
So there's a whole lot of hoopla about her, but I've got to tell you that one of the most amazing things I've heard her say is probably one of the most controversial within the party, and I don't really understand why, but the idea that it's not enough to be passively against racism. We have to actively be anti-racist. I can stand by all day. It gives me chills because it is exactly what we need to be, not just for minorities in ethnicity, but for minorities in gender. So as we celebrate Women's Equality Day, how can you not stand behind that? Like, I don't even know how somebody who is going to vote can talk themselves into voting for rapist A versus rapist B, or at least harasser A versus harasser B, when there is a woman out there willing to fight for the rights of all of us.
Yeah, 2020 is a weird time in politics, but it also opens up new doors and opportunities for the Libertarian Party. So, just kind of want to get your thoughts on the Let Her Speak movement. And what
you know, this is one of the reasons that I love Jess Meir so much. When Jo Jorgensen was first nominated, there was a few hashtags tossed around. She's with us, or I'm with her. And then the Let Her Speak came out, and it's somehow or another, and I think probably it has a lot to do with people on her team, but that hashtag trended quickly and largely. So I think we need to have a Let Her Speak movement, and I think it needs to be bigger than the Me Too. I think it needs to be bigger than Time's Up. I mean, if we can apply Time's Up to Let Her Speak, if you look at what happened in the Me Too movement, women were shut down. There was a list of people who were known harassers of women in the sexual context that women were sharing with each other privately, that somehow or another made its way to some of the men who were on the list, and then they were shamed for acknowledging that these men were harassers and that they were known. So Harvey Weinstein got a sentence, right? Epstein was in jail, but what are they really doing? They're certainly not letting her speak, and that is all her across the board.
Yeah, it's a crazy time. Well, Angela, I appreciate you coming on the stream. Always want to hear more from you. And it's always good to hear from libertarians from all over the different political
Great.
spectrum.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, have a good day, and we shall
You
get
too.
on.
Well, today actually is 3 years to the date at the anniversary of Hurricane Harvey. And that's really personal for me because during Harvey in Houston, 3 years ago now, which seems crazy, I was serving as the executive director of an animal welfare nonprofit here in town called Houston PetSet. And we had to mobilize immediately. We shifted all of our activities to supporting the animals who were suffering. We worked with FEMA, we worked with Harris County Animal Shelter, we worked with a number of groups to convert our Astro Arena into a temporary shelter for homeless animals during the hurricane. And, I'm kind of having some flashback moments here as I'm battening down the hatches, but thinking about people in crisis and how we come together, I'll say that the same kind of feelings and emotions and fears that I had around Hurricane Harvey are the feelings and emotions I've experienced during this election cycle and over the last, 4 to 6 months, really. The fear related to COVID-19, the fear related to police brutality in our Black communities.
There's very real consequences that are coming out right now.
Related to that, it brings up emotions and it brings up responses. And I think, with Angela also talking about consent and hormones and emotions, that reminded me that our responses are sometimes absolutely primal. And when we talk about women's equality and women's rights and consent and some of these topics that really bring up an emotional response and reaction in people, this is where the libertarian principles and the libertarian movement, I think, really shines, and that we lead with do no harm, lead with respect for all. We lead with all of your freedoms all of the time. And that's where I really say that I was able to lean in to being a libertarian and ascribing with the liberty movement, that it recognized you're going to have emotions and responses and fears, and you're allowed to feel them. And we're here for you, and we respect you as you're going through these challenges. And we want to help you find a way that's respectful of your rights and of other people's rights to navigate these crisis moments and challenging situations.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the fun things about how we can take policy now. If we look at it not from the red, blue paradigm, but just like what are the practical policies that are going to help people. Let's talk about our history, but let's do it unemotionally and say, here's the things that were causing trouble and here's the things that we can fix.
I'll say, not to negate emotions, but to recognize them, to name them, and recognize where they come into play in our decision making, and to be respectful of others in that as well.
Yeah, and that's the core, I think, of the libertarian greater philosophy. You could call it the non-aggression principle.
Yes.
But in general, just respecting somebody else, whether a man or woman or whatever race, or who cares. That you have human rights, and that's kind of been the biggest focus of the party. That's why I think it ultimately unites so many of these different groups, though, in different ways. Lauren, how did you really get involved in the Let Her Speak movement more than anything else?
Sure. So that's a great question, Colin. People for Liberty, we founded People for Liberty back in May, really. And the impetus was grassroots volunteers coming together and really talking about where do we think that we can best be of service in this movement. And, we had initially come together around Dr. Jo Jorgensen as the Libertarian candidate. And where and how were people learning about her, learning about the Libertarian Party, and, how could we help facilitate raising awareness, raising money if possible, and really helping people to connect to the message of liberty as they found it in their own lives. And so I'm very blessed that I have some amazing friends, amazing women friends, female friends, one of whom is Liz Coleman. And she reached out to me early on and said, hey, I'd like to start some peer-based or affinity groups around women voters, former Republicans or former Democrats, the LGBTQ community, Black voters, people who are interested in learning about Dr. Jo Jorgensen as a candidate and about the Libertarian Party and principles, who don't see themselves in either party. And I said, okay, all right, I've worked with nonprofits for 15, 20 years, formal social worker, evolutionary psychology, public policy background, and working within peer groups and affinity groups made sense to me, because what we've seen is that people don't see themselves in either party. And they felt like neither of the major parties represented them. And so leaning into peer-based or affinity groups was a way to really work within identity politics, but I think that gets a really bad rap. So it gets a bad rap when it's used in name only, and it's used as a talking point or a sound bite. But really creating groups for the purpose of listening and engaging, that made sense to me. So working with Liz to help launch these affinity groups, Women Voters for Jo Jorgensen, I mentioned a number of others, was kind of our first foray into this experience. And as we started to move forward, Casey Daly, who was working with us at the time, said, guys, in addition to, bringing peers together, I really see that there's a problem that the duopoly isn't allowing Jo into the debates.
Right.
How can we make a difference about that? How can we raise awareness about that? And so it was through these questions and listening and learning and really making thoughtful decisions that both People for Liberty came into being as an umbrella organization supporting grassroots movements, and also how Let Her Speak spun off as its own unincorporated group of people who were interested in a marketing campaign and raising awareness around the fact that third-party candidates are excluded from the national presidential debates. So it was this organic timeline, and I feel so grateful for Liz Coleman and Casey Daly, Ryan Thompson, and Jennifer McAvee, and Stephanie Diaz, and other volunteers who worked with us through this journey early on to say, how can we listen? How can we learn? How can we engage people, embrace those principles of liberty that are meaningful for us, and affect change at the national, state, and local level? And so People for Liberty coming into existence as both a 501c4 nonprofit and a super PAC meant that we would have the opportunity to support these grassroots movements, these groups that were doing their own thing already. They knew what the heck they were doing. They didn't need us telling them what to do.
Right.
And this is in line with the libertarian principles. Less government, more people. And so People for Liberty is here to support those movements and those opportunities. And it's been a joy to watch Let Her Speak take off, again, organically, with smart strategy, with dedicated people, and by creating a path and tools and resources for people to launch their own events. I think it's been really inspiring and, fun. And when was the last time that you could say politics was fun? That video from the bus tour in Austin, I think captures a little bit of the passion, that people are passionate about Jo. They're passionate about the libertarian principles, and they're passionate about breaking the duopoly that has such a stranglehold on our country. And so, again, we're going to hear from Casey later on at 5 o'clock Central Standard Time this evening, but I think, and I hope that gives a little bit of an insight into who People for Liberty is as an organization, the rise of the Let Her Speak movement as a grassroots initiative, a little bit about our affinity groups. And, in regards to our event here today, we knew that women's issues are everyone's issues.